You know, usually when we look at a map of the world, our eyes are naturally drawn to the land
Right,
masses.
the continents and borders.
Exactly. We see the nations, the solid ground where, we're taught that history supposedly happens. But if you shift your perspective and look at the vast stretches of blue, specifically the Indian Ocean, suddenly that conventional map feels, entirely broken.
It really does. It flips the whole geopolitical script.
It totally does. Today, we're looking at the invisible lines in the water that actually keep your lights on, your phone connected, and your gas tank full. We are diving into the most contested, volatile, and honestly, economically vital body of water on Earth.
Which is a massive undertaking.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to execute a deep dive into the geopolitics, the security environment, and the economic dynamics of the Indian Ocean region. This is an intensive look at the compiled intelligence materials you've brought to us, exploring how nations are aggressively maneuvering to control global supply chains. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's do it. And to unpack it effectively, we really have to look at how these invisible lines in the water translate into actual leverage.
Hard power.
Exactly. Throughout this deep dive, we're going to see a very clear pattern emerge, like a chain of causality that drives everything in the Indian Ocean region, or the IOR as it's known in the policy world.
Okay, so what's the starting point of that chain?
It always starts with geopolitics.
Yeah.
The grand ambitions of nations. Those ambitions inevitably trigger economic shifts as countries try to secure their energy and trade routes.
Makes sense. The money follows the power.
Right. And then those economic maneuvers necessitate hard security responses, like building naval bases or, deploying surveillance aircraft.
And I'm guessing all of that eventually hits the ground level.
Precisely. Finally, all of that external posturing eventually results in a domestic impact, altering the actual lives of the people who live in these strategic locations.
That is such a solid framework. Geopolitics to economy to security to domestic impact.
It really helps organize the chaos. So today, we're analyzing the physical characteristics of this massive theater, China's really aggressive expansion from a land-focused power to a maritime powerhouse, and India's strategic balancing act in both the Western Indian Ocean and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands.
And we're also digging into the institutions, right?
Yes, finally, we'll look at the crucial institutional developments shaping the region. So things like the Colombo Security Conclave and that highly controversial Diego Garcia sovereignty transition.
Well, let's start by mapping the board. To understand the geopolitical competition we're seeing on the news every day, we first have to understand the physical and economic geography of this space.
You have to know the terrain.
Right. So why is this specific body of water, out of all the oceans on the planet, the absolute center of gravity for global competition right now?
Well, it really comes down to scale and position. Look at its boundaries. The Indian Ocean is bounded by Africa and the Arabian Peninsula to the west. To the north, you have Iran, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. To the east, the Malay Peninsula, the Sunda Islands, and Australia. And to the south, the freezing expanses of the Southern Ocean.
That's a huge footprint.
It's massive. In the southwest, it joins the Atlantic, and to the east and southeast, it mingles with the Pacific. This isn't just, a localized sea or some regional lake. It covers 7 distinct time zones.
Wow. 7 time zones.
Yeah, it encompasses almost half of the world's latitudes. When you are operating in the Indian Ocean, you are operating across a staggering breadth of the planet.
Just wrap your head around that. That scale is immense. And beneath the surface, the sources note that it is quite literally the hard drive of global connectivity.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, it hosts the dense network of submarine fiber optic cables that keep the modern world online. If those cables get cut, the global financial system essentially goes dark.
Completely dark.
But above the surface, the diversity of the stakeholders is what really jumps out at me. The materials state explicitly that there are more than 35 countries bordering this ocean.
Exactly. And the political and economic spectrum of those 35 nations is what dictates the incredibly complex security environment.
How so?
Well, on one side, you have the emerging and frankly highly volatile democracies of East Africa. Then, almost 4,000 miles away on the eastern shores, you have the rapidly evolving state of Indonesia.
Right.
In between, the contrasts are just jarring. You have the violence-prone nations of the Horn of Africa right next to the intense geopolitical challenges and immense wealth of the Gulf states.
The massive disparity.
Huge. Plus, you have the fast-developing massive economies of India and Southeast Asia, teetering neighbors like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, navigating severe domestic crises, and rising powers trying to assert dominance.
And it's not just local powers, right?
No, not at all. On top of that, you have Western nations like France and the UK that actually hold sovereign real estate and territory right in the middle of the region.
Which brings a lot of firepower to the neighborhood. Because of that immense diversity and strategic value, it's heavily militarized. The materials state explicitly that the Indian Ocean is the most nuclearized ocean on the planet.
It's a crowded space.
I mean, think about the nuclear powers whose navies actively ply these waters. You have the United States, the UK, France, Russia, China, India, and Israel.
All operating in the same space.
Yeah. You have nuclear submarines and aircraft carrier strike groups sharing the same water with rampant, localized piracy operations off the coast of Somalia. And it simultaneously serves as a massive, decentralized arena for global drug smuggling. It's a wildly crowded and dangerous theater.
Which brings us to the economic geography, because that is the true trigger event for all of this militarization. What's fascinating here is the sheer volume of global survival that depends on this specific water.
Let's hear the numbers.
The statistics are sobering. Over 90% of global trade and 2/3 of the world's oil supplies travel by sea. And within the Indian Ocean, the flow of that energy is restricted by immense geographic bottlenecks.
Choke points.
Exactly. 40% of all seaborne crude oil passes through just one choke point at one end, the Strait of Hormuz, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea.
That's almost half the world's oil.
Right. And at the other end, the Strait of Malacca, nestled between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, hosts 50% of the world's merchant fleet.
Okay, let's put a real number on that because 50% of the merchant fleet sounds a bit abstract. The sources state we are talking about approximately 90,000 ships passing through the Malacca Strait every single year.
It's staggering.
90,000 massive cargo vessels, oil tankers, and bulk carriers. That is a maritime traffic jam of epic proportions. So we have these principal oil shipping lanes converging at what the briefings call the main naval navigational choke points of world commerce.
Like the key valves.
Yeah. If we look at the map, we have the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb acting as the gateway to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, then the Strait of Hormuz controlling the flow out of the Middle East, and the Strait of Malacca acting as the gateway to Asia and the Pacific.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can really think of these choke points as the physical valves of the global economy. Whoever controls, monitors, or can heavily influence those three straits effectively has their hand on that valve.
They can just shut it off.
Exactly. They can shut off the energy that powers entire continents. And this realization, this geographic vulnerability, is the absolute root cause of the most significant geopolitical shift of the 21st century.
Which is China, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
China's strategic pivot from a traditional land power to a highly aggressive sea power.
Right, because historically China has been preoccupied with land invasions. For millennia, their threats came from the steppes, from the north, from the west.
The Great Wall wasn't built for ships.
Exactly. But the sources note that today China is more secure on its land borders than it has been throughout its entire history. Because that continental anxiety is largely settled, they could finally look seaward.
And they did.
And when they did, they experienced a dramatic, explosive economic boom. From the 1990s onward, there was an explosion of trade and commerce along its eastern coast, transforming China into the factory of the world and a major shipbuilder.
But here is the critical vulnerability, the strategic dilemma that keeps Beijing awake at night. Despite this massive coastal economy, China has never had an enduring historical presence in the Indian Ocean.
Which is weird to think about given their size now.
It is, but it sharply differentiates them from other great powers. The U.S., France, and Britain have long maintained territory, populations, island bases, and permanent naval presences there. India, obviously, is the resident power.
So where does China fit in?
Well, China approaches the Indian Ocean essentially as a landlocked power-seeking port. Geographically, to reach the Indian Ocean from their own coast, Chinese vessels have to navigate through the South China Sea, pass through that heavily congested Strait of Malacca, and enter an ocean where they have no historical home bases.
And the motivation for desperately seeking those ports is pure energy survival. The numbers in the brief are just stark. As China industrialized, its demand for crude oil doubled between 1995 and 2005.
Doubled in 10 years.
And it is projected to double again by 2025. And here is the terrifying part for their strategic planners. More than 85% of that China-bound oil must pass across the span of the Indian Ocean. It largely originates from the Middle East and Africa and then funnels through that narrow Strait of Malacca.
This is the strategic crux of their entire foreign policy. It's often called the Malacca Dilemma. Over 85% of their vital energy supply, the lifeblood of their economy, their military, their domestic stability, is floating across an ocean they do not control.
Guarded by navies they don't command.
Exactly, and funneling through choke points they do not dominate. If a conflict were to erupt, say, over Taiwan or in the South China Sea, and an adversary like the United States or India decided to blockade the Strait of Malacca, the Chinese economy would grind to a halt within weeks.
Weeks?
Therefore, China's desperate search for alternate energy routes is the single greatest factor motivating its grand strategy. They're trying to bypass this vulnerability,
How do they do that?
whether by projecting naval power into the Pacific or by building massive overland pipelines into China via Central Asia, Pakistan, and Myanmar.
Wait, so let me make sure I have this straight. Because they are so incredibly vulnerable to a blockade at Malacca, they can't just rely on pipelines. They have to actually go out and physically secure the ocean route, too.
Exactly. Overland pipelines are incredibly expensive. They're technologically difficult to build across mountainous terrain. And ultimately, they can never carry the sheer volume of oil that massive supertankers can.
It's just not enough volume.
Right. Sea freight is simply too efficient to replace entirely. So China has to secure the sea lanes, the SLOC sea lanes of communication.
So how does that vulnerability translate into action? The economic implications we are seeing are massive. Over the last decade, China has steadily expanded its maritime presence in the Indian Ocean, the coastal region.
They've been very busy.
Yeah, they aren't just sending a few ships on goodwill tours. They are utilizing a multifaceted, highly aggressive strategy.
They are executing continuous year-round deployments of naval forces. They are heavily involved in arms sales to coastal nations. They are actively creating bases, access facilities, ramping up military diplomacy, and cultivating special political relations with littoral states.
And the money. We can't forget the money.
Crucially, yes, they are lavishly dispersing developmental finance for strategic ends. This is where geoeconomics blends with security.
The Belt and Road Initiative, right?
Specifically, under the umbrella of the Maritime Silk Road, which is the maritime component of the Belt and Road Initiative. China acts as the primary platform to collaborate on infrastructure. They offer massive loans to build deep-water ports in countries that desperately need infrastructure.
But there's a catch.
Always. Those commercial ports are often designed with dual-use capabilities in mind. A port that can berth a massive cargo ship can often berth a naval destroyer.
And there's a fascinating administrative alibi they use to justify getting their navy into the region in the first place. The sources explicitly state that China has used the alibi of anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden to systematically ramp up the scale and frequency of its naval presence.
It's a classic loophole.
Right. In other words, they're basically using the equivalent of a neighborhood watch as an excuse to park a tank on your street.
It is a brilliant, if transparent strategic maneuver. Starting in 2008, when Somali piracy was really at its peak, the international community asked for help. China volunteered, sending naval task forces to escort merchant ships.
Okay, that makes sense on paper.
Sure. But long after the piracy threat diminished, the Chinese Navy stayed. They used the ongoing anti-piracy mandate to learn how to sustain long-term deployments far from their home shores. They mapped the ocean floor, understood the operating environment, and normalized the presence of Chinese warships in the Indian Ocean.
Which raises a massive red flag for the existing resident powers, primarily India. China's growing presence isn't just a generic expansion into empty space. It directly contests India's strategic role.
India has always viewed the Indian Ocean as its strategic backyard.
Exactly. Now, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLA Navy, is growing in strength and complemented by China's expanding maritime ties with India's immediate neighbors like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia. This poses a severe and direct threat to India's national security.
It's often referred to conceptually as the string of pearls strategy, surrounding India with Chinese-influenced ports.
We see this friction reflected very aggressively in the institutional and legal dimensions, too. The broad-based trend of China's presence has now reached right up to India's doorstep, into the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal.
They're getting very close.
Yeah, Chinese naval submarines and highly advanced oceanographic survey vessels are quite literally on the prowl there. The intelligence brief notes they have occasionally entered India's exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, without any prior intimation.
Let's break down that terminology for a second because it's vital. An EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, extends 200 nautical miles from a country's coastline.
Okay.
Now, it's not strictly sovereign territorial water where you have absolute control over who enters, but under maritime law, the coastal state has exclusive rights to the resources there, the fish, the oil, the seabed minerals.
Right, the economic rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And crucially, if a foreign military vessel is conducting surveys or military activities in your EEZ, it is generally expected, legally and diplomatically, that they notify you.
Which China isn't doing.
No. So when Chinese survey vessels enter India's EEZ without prior intimation, they are mapping the seabed, likely for submarine routes, and they are doing it to explicitly test India's sovereignty and legal boundaries. It is a direct friction point.
And this forces a monumental shift in Indian strategy. We have to look at the macro-level trajectories here. Both China and India are rising powers with aspirations of great power status.
Both have massive populations.
Yeah. Right. And both are on a desperate quest for energy security to fuel their industrial growth. This has led both nations to redirect their strategic focus from their contested land borders in the Himalayas out toward the sea.
But their geographic trajectories are inherently conflicting.
How so?
Well, China, situated to the north, seeks to expand its influence vertically, from north to south, pushing down through the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean.
Okay, north to south.
Right. India, situated centrally in the Indian Ocean, seeks to expand its influence horizontally from east to west, securing its flanks from the Strait of Malacca all the way to the Gulf of Aden. This physical intersection of their strategic ambitions guarantees long-term strategic friction.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The brief points out that India has not faced any significant maritime threat since its independence in 1947.
It's a long time.
Yeah. Its wars have been fought on land, in the mountains, against Pakistan and China. So how does India, which is the largest resident power of the Indian Ocean, literally the only ocean on Earth named after a single country due to India's deep maritime history, how does it suddenly pivot its massive military bureaucracy to respond to a naval threat?
India's dilemma is profound and highly time-sensitive. India is soon to become the world's fourth largest energy consumer. As it pushes initiatives like Atmanirbhar Bharat, Self-Reliant India, to boost domestic manufacturing, its energy needs are just skyrocketing.
More factories mean more power needed.
Exactly. And just like China, India is fundamentally dependent on imported energy. It relies on oil for more than 90% of its energy needs.
90%.
Yeah. And crucially, 90% of that oil will come from the Persian Gulf by way of the Arabian Sea. India must satisfy the energy demands of the largest population in the world, over 1.4 billion people. Therefore, the Indian Ocean is the primary sea of India.
They can't afford to lose control there.
No ocean is in need of strategic stability more than the Indian Ocean. And India absolutely must act as the most prominent stakeholder to ensure those sea lanes remain open.
Okay, if you had to summarize the absolute core of this first major section for someone trying to grasp the big picture, say, someone prepping to brief their CEO or policy analysis on this, what is the fundamental cause and effect of China's maritime expansion here?
Okay, if you are structuring the narrative, it always begins chronologically with the economic trigger. China's explosive economic boom doubled its energy demands between 1995 and 2005 and is projecting to double them again by 2025.
So a massive energy deficit.
Right. That creates an immense vulnerability because over 85% of that vital oil must pass through the Indian Ocean, specifically funneling through the narrow Strait of Malacca.
The Malacca dilemma.
Exactly. Because China is functionally a landlocked power in this specific theater, it was forced to shift from a secure continental power to an aggressive seaward orientation.
And how are they executing that?
The mechanism they use to solve this is the Maritime Silk Road, dispersing developmental finance, building ports, and cultivating deep ties with littoral states like Bangladesh and Myanmar. To back up this economic push with hard power, they leverage the alibi of anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden to maintain continuous naval deployments.
Which brings us to the impact on India.
Right. Ultimately, this massive projection of power creates direct, physical, strategic friction with India. This is evidenced by PLA Navy survey vessels probing India's EEZ without prior intimation, directly contesting India's historical role as the dominant resident power.
If I were writing a 250-word answer structure on this intro, body, conclusion, how would that flow?
The intro would establish energy security as the prime driver of modern geopolitics. The body would detail China's transition from land to sea due to the Malacca Dilemma, utilizing the maritime Silk Road and the anti-piracy alibi. The conclusion would highlight the inevitable clash as India defends its resident status and its own 90% dependency on Persian Gulf oil.
I love that. And we keep coming back to these specific geographic bottlenecks. Let's just reiterate why these specific straits are the center of the universe right now.
The geography dictates the global supply chain.
Hmm.
You have the Strait of Malacca, which hosts 50% of the world's merchant fleet. That's approximately 90,000 ships annually.
90,000 ships.
Right. It is the absolute vital artery for China's Pacific-bound energy routes and trade. Then you have the Strait of Hormuz, which facilitates 40% of all seaborne crude oil. This is the critical vulnerability for India, given its 90% dependency on Persian Gulf oil.
And the third one.
And finally, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. This is the gateway from the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea, leading to the Suez Canal and European markets. It's the critical juncture for East-West trade, and not coincidentally, its proximity to the Horn of Africa makes it the focal point for those vital anti-piracy operations and international military basing.
Listeners, when you are tracking the news, these are the keywords and concepts you need to be actively listening for. Whenever you hear about SLOC sea lanes of communication, or the Strait of Malacca, Hormuz, or Bab el-Mandeb, you are hearing about the structural integrity of the global economy.
It's all connected.
When you hear about the maritime Silk Road, developmental finance, or countries asserting their EEZ rights, you are seeing the modern toolkit of geopolitical competition. It's not always aircraft carriers. Sometimes it's developmental loans and survey vessels.
Let's do a quick mental check on the scale of this dependency before we move to India's response. Remember the core metrics driving this entire conflict.
Go ahead.
90,000 ships choke through Malacca every year. 85% of China's economic survival, its oil, floats across the Indian Ocean, and 90% of India's oil comes from the Persian Gulf. By 2025, China's crude oil demand will have doubled again from its 2005 levels. The sheer volume of energy moving across this water is what makes it a powder keg.
Exactly. The cause-effect chain is undeniable. Economic boom leads to massive energy dependency. That dependency on vulnerable sea lanes forces maritime expansion. That expansion-seeking ports, dispersing developmental finance, and deploying naval assets under anti-piracy alibis directly results in a threat to the resident powers.
Which forces a response.
And that brings us perfectly to how India actually pushes back. Let's unpack Section 2. India's strategic imperatives and response in the Western Indian Ocean region. We've established the broad threat of China's expansion. Now we need to transition to the specific geographic theaters where the chess pieces are actually moving.
Right, the theoretical becomes physical.
Exactly. China has made highly aggressive physical moves in the Western Indian Ocean, forcing India to scramble and respond.
To understand India's scramble, we really have to look at the background of India's historical posture. As we said, India is the largest resident power and the most prominent stakeholder in the Indian Ocean. But its traditional focus, its naval resources, and its diplomatic energy haven't always extended deeply into the far reaches of the Western Indian Ocean, particularly the east coast of Africa.
It was sort of out of sight, out of mind.
Somewhat. It considered the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea its immediate neighborhood, but the coast of Africa was often a secondary priority.
So what woke them up?
The massive trigger event that completely shattered that complacency and changed the strategic calculus in New Delhi was China successfully building its first ever foreign military base in Djibouti.
Let's pause on Djibouti. For those visualizing the map, Djibouti is a tiny nation situated right on the Horn of Africa, perfectly positioned at the edge of the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, looking right up into the Red Sea. Why does China care so much about this specific spot? It's not just about anti-piracy, right?
Oh, exactly. The anti-piracy operations were the alibi to get into the neighborhood. But the root cause for China's deep, permanent infrastructure investment there is control and surveillance over the Southwest Indian Ocean.
And it's not just Djibouti they're looking at.
No, China has been making heavy investments in African port infrastructure all down the eastern coast of the continent. They're looking closely at the Mozambique Channel.
Why the Mozambique Channel?
The brief notes, this channel, which runs between the island nation of Madagascar and the coast of Mozambique, is a critical maritime highway. Why? Because it is used by shipping that is transiting via the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa.
Ah, the alternate road.
Right. If a crisis closes the Suez Canal or the Red Sea, which we've seen happen with the Ever Given ship getting stuck, or with regional conflicts, global shipping has to reroute around the entire continent of Africa.
Yeah.
If you control or monitor the Mozambique Channel, you have eyes on the only massive alternate route to the Suez Canal.
That makes perfect sense. It's about redundancy in the supply chain. So the stakeholders in this Western theater are incredibly diverse, and they are all watching China's moves. You have India, obviously. You have island nations like Mauritius and Sri Lanka. So you have Western powers like France, the UK, and the US.
Everyone's involved.
India looks at this map, sees Chinese ports dotting the African coast and a military base in Djibouti, and realizes its objective must be clearly defined. In its maritime security strategy, India states it aims to project itself as a net security provider in the region.
Which is a bold claim.
Right. In plain English, India wants to be the local cop on the beat. The strategic motivations are clear. Secure those sea lanes of communication, ensure the oil keeps flowing to Mumbai and Gujarat, and balance the hard power against China's rising influence before it becomes an irreversible hegemony.
But declaring yourself the net security provider and actually having the physical capability to do it are two very different things.
Yeah, talk is cheap.
It's exactly. The impact on India requires a massive, incredibly expensive operational shift. The intelligence sources state quite clearly that India's maritime engagements in waters close to the western coast of Africa have been historically limited. To overcome this geographical and historical gap, India has initiated a program of rapid capability development and capacity building. They are utilizing a blend of soft power economics and hard power security implications.
Let's start with the soft power. Economically, India recognizes the need for the development of the blue economy.
The sustainable use of ocean resources.
Right. And they are aggressively partnering with the island nations in the region to take a leadership role in dealing with climate change. For low-lying island states like the Maldives or Seychelles, climate change and rising sea levels are an existential threat.
It's life or death for them.
By leading on climate initiatives in the blue economy, India builds immense diplomatic goodwill. But let's be real, soft power only goes so far when the other guy is building naval bases. The immediate hard power security implication is what fascinates me. India's deployment of the P-8I long-range surveillance aircraft.
This is a crucial operational data point. The P-8I Poseidon is an absolute game changer. It is a highly advanced multi-mission maritime patrol aircraft. It is designed for long-range anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface warfare, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance.
So it's not just a camera in the sky.
Oh, far from it. It can fly up thousands of miles, drop sonobuoys to listen for submarines, use advanced radar to track surface fleets, and stay on station for hours. Let's detail exactly how India is using them to execute its balancing strategy. The brief highlights a specific, highly strategic location, Agalega Island in Mauritius.
Right, Mauritius is an independent island nation located off the southeast coast of Africa. But Agalega is a remote dependency of Mauritius. It consists of two tiny islands located over 1,100 kilometers north of the main island of Mauritius.
It's way out there.
It is essentially sitting right in the middle of the western Indian Ocean. And the satellite imagery the sources cite from April 20th, 2022, revealed massive, undeniable construction on this tiny strip of sand.
The specifics of that construction matter immensely. They didn't just build a small airstrip for tourist planes. The imagery showed the construction of a massive 10,000-foot runway and a deep water jetty.
10,000 feet is massive.
Furthermore, the 2022 imagery showed hangars under construction right next to that runway that are large enough to house the Indian Navy's massive P-8I aircraft. Maritime security experts view this as absolute confirmation that India plans to deploy its P-8I aircraft there, and likely already has.
It's a strategic outpost.
Think about the geography. By placing a 10,000-foot runway 1,100 kilometers north of Mauritius, India essentially builds an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean. This infrastructure allows India to support its maritime assets deep in the western Indian Ocean, projecting surveillance power and anti-submarine capabilities much closer to the western coast of Africa and the Mozambique Channel, directly monitoring Chinese activities.
And it's not just bilateral deals with Mauritius. The brief mentions La Réunion Island. Now, La Réunion is fascinating because it is actually an overseas department of France. It is sovereign French territory right in the southern Indian Ocean.
Which is incredibly useful for India.
India previously deployed a P-8I aircraft there on a 5-day mission to undertake coordinated surveillance with French Navy warships. This perfectly illustrates India's diplomatic outreach strategy. They know they cannot balance China entirely alone, so they are actively partnering with external resident powers like France, which has massive EEZ holdings in the Indian Ocean, to secure the region.
We also see this balancing act playing out heavily in the institutional and legal dimensions. Security isn't just runways and aircraft, it's treaties, dialogues, and alliances. The most significant institutional mechanism highlighted in the brief is the Colombo Security Conclave, or CSC. We need to look at the sixth NSA National Security Advisor level meeting, which was held on December 7, 2023, in Mauritius.
The attendee list for these meetings is basically a geopolitical thermometer, because presence, and especially absence, tells you exactly who is aligning with whom.
Very true.
Present at the 6th NSA meeting were India, Mauritius, and Sri Lanka. Observer countries were Seychelles and Bangladesh. But crucially, the Maldives did not participate.
That's a big absence.
They were conspicuously absent, and this followed the creation of their new government, which campaigned on an India Out platform and sought closer ties with Beijing. That absence shows how fiercely contested these island nations are.
Exactly. Despite the Maldives' absence, India used this sixth NSA-level meeting to emphasize the pivotal role of the Colombo Security Conclave in ensuring the security and stability of the region. The NSAs deliberately focused on maritime safety, countering terrorism, and regional stability.
With China obviously being the elephant in the room.
Right, operating in the unstated but obvious backdrop of China's growing ambitions and influence operations. And they successfully agreed on a joint CSC roadmap for 2024. This is a classic example of India engaging the region through formal institutional mechanisms, working alongside other multilateral institutes like BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal Initiative, and IRI, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, to weave a web of security partnerships.
So we have India building runways in Mauritius, partnering with France and La Réunion, and leading security conclaves. What does this all mean for the existing legacy Western maritime security architecture?
Ah, the old guard.
Right. Because the US and the UK have been the dominant players here since the end of World War II. This brings us to a massive, ongoing geopolitical and legal earthquake: the Chagos Islands and the Diego Garcia dispute. This is textbook geopolitics leading to security and domestic implications.
To understand Diego Garcia, the background timeline is absolutely essential. The Chagos Archipelago is a group of atolls in the central Indian Ocean. Historically, it was administered by the British as a dependency of their colony, Mauritius.
Okay.
But in 1965, 3 years before Mauritius was granted its independence, Britain essentially blackmailed the Mauritian leadership. They separated the Chagos Islands from Mauritius and kept control of them, creating a new colony called the British Indian Ocean Territory, or BIOT. Keep in mind, Mauritius itself lies about 2,100 kilometers southwest of the Chagos Islands.
And the reason Britain wanted to keep this remote string of atolls was a secret arrangement with the United States during the Cold War. Since the 1970s, Diego Garcia, the largest footprint-shaped island in that chain, has been transformed into a massive, highly secretive joint US-UK military base. It's vital to their operations.
It is a vital, irreplaceable hub for long-range bombers like B-52s, nuclear submarines, and preposition naval ships. American military authorities have literally called it an all but indispensable platform for security operations. They used it heavily during the Gulf War, the invasion of Afghanistan, and the Iraq War to project power into the Middle East, South Asia, and East Africa.
But the creation of that base required a profound human tragedy. Between 1967 and 1973, the UK forcibly expelled the entire indigenous population of the Chagos Islands, about 1,500 to 2,000 Chagosians, primarily to Mauritius and the Seychelles, so the US military could have a sterile island.
That's awful.
For decades, the displaced Chagosians and the government of Mauritius fought a relentless legal and diplomatic battle, garnering immense international support. Finally, the legal and geopolitical status quo ruptured. In 2019, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ in The Hague, issued a sweeping advisory opinion.
And what did they say? While non-binding, it carried massive legal and moral weight. The ICJ ruled that the UK had unlawfully carved up Mauritius in 1965 and that their continued administration of the Chagos Archipelago was a wrongful act that must end.
And this leads to the trigger event for the future architecture of the entire Western Indian Ocean. After decades of stubborn refusal and then years of complex negotiations facing overwhelming international pressure at the UN, in October 2024, Britain formally agreed to cede sovereignty over the Chagos Islands back to the government of Mauritius.
However, in geopolitics, sovereignty rarely comes without immense caveats. There is a massive security condition attached to this October 2024 agreement. The treaty stipulates that while Mauritius gets the flag and the sovereign title to the islands, the UK and US military base will continue operating unhindered on Diego Garcia for a 99-year lease.
99 years. So essentially, the U.S. secures its indispensable bomber base for a century, while the U.K. washes its hands of the colonial legacy, and Mauritius gets a massive diplomatic victory and likely a lot of lease money.
But it's not over for the people.
No. There are deep, lingering domestic impacts here regarding the displaced Chagashans. The UK agreement stated that those displaced who are still alive and their descendants will finally have a right to return to the islands. The UK is now free to implement a resettlement program and build infrastructure everywhere in the archipelago except Diego Garcia itself, which remains a sterile military zone.
They're also setting up a fund, right?
The UK will also establish a trust fund to financially support the Chagashans. This is a huge shift, considering the Chagashans had previously fought all the way to the Supreme Court in the UK in 2016 regarding their right to return and loss.
And even with this landmark October 2024 agreement, severe friction remains. Domestic politics constantly shape foreign policy. Shortly after the agreement was announced, a newly elected prime minister took power in Mauritius. He almost immediately stated he wants to review and potentially renegotiate the deal, seeking significantly more financial compensation for the displaced persons, which the UK has stubbornly not agreed to revisit.
So it's still shaky.
Meanwhile, factions within the U.S. political and defense establishment have expressed deep security concerns about the deal. They fear that Mauritius, which has close economic ties with China, might eventually allow Chinese surveillance facilities on the outer islands of the archipelago, spying on the U.S. base at Diego Garcia.
Oh, wow.
The future implications are complex. The 99-year lease theoretically secures Western military presence, but the shifting sovereignty fundamentally alters the diplomatic leverage and the balance of power in the Western Indian Ocean.
So if we pull all these threads together, India's expansion, the French partnerships, the UK-US base transition, how would you structure an analysis of India's capacity building in the Western IOR to balance this environment? If you were writing a briefing memo or a 150-word answer framework on this, how do you logically flow from the problem to the solution?
The logical progression is clear. The trigger is always China's rapid, undeniable expansion in the Western IOR. When they planted their flag with a military base in Djibouti and began pouring billions into African ports along the vital Mozambique Channel, they threatened regional stability and India's energy lifelines.
The problem.
Right? In response to this existential threat, India was forced to abandon its historical hesitancy and dramatically enhance its operational reach, striving to act as a genuine net security provider. The physical infrastructure of this response is evident on Mauritius's Agalega Island, where India financed a 10,000-foot runway and hangars to host its P-8I long-range surveillance aircraft, creating a strategic outpost deep in the ocean.
The solution.
But hard power isn't enough. India couples this with robust diplomacy, conducting coordinated surveillance operations with the French Navy from La Réunion and driving regional alignment through the Colombo Security Conclave. Combined with sustainable initiatives like the Blue Economy, these measures represent India's comprehensive multi-domain strategy to balance Chinese power and secure the vital sea lanes along the east coast of Africa.
That concept of island territories acting as physical anchors is fascinating. Let's look deeper at the strategic significance of these specific islands: Agalega, La Réunion, Diego Garcia. Why are small rocks in the ocean so vital to modern maritime security?
Island territories in the Indian Ocean function essentially as unsinkable aircraft carriers. In an ocean that covers 7 time zones, the tyrant is distance. Ships and aircraft have limited fuel.
You need pit stops.
By possessing or having access to islands, a military gains critical logistical hubs for refueling, resupplying, and projecting surveillance reach over vast maritime distances that would otherwise be blind spots. Their strategic significance is amplified exponentially due to China's growing footprint.
It's all about access.
India uses Agalega and its partnership with France on La Réunion to monitor the crucial Mozambique Channel, overcoming its historically limited engagement near Africa. Similarly, the entire Western security architecture relies on the indispensable role of Diego Garcia as a joint U.S.-UK base.
Right.
The October 2024 agreement, where the UK cedes sovereignty to Mauritius following the 2019 ICJ ruling, but secures a 99-year lease, guarantees the continuous Western power projection. Whether utilized for India's P-8I submarine hunters or US B-52 long-range bombers, control and access to these island chains physically dictate the balance of power, the freedom of navigation, and ultimately the security of global supply chains in the Western IOR.
It's all about access and geography. And just to remind our listeners, India isn't just relying on military hardware. The institutional measures are just as vital to establishing presence without looking like a conqueror.
You need the soft touch, too.
They used the Colombo Security Conclave, actively engaging at the NSA level, like we saw in Mauritius in December 2023, to deliberate on regional security and subtly counter Chinese ambitions. They utilized broader multilateral institutes like BIMSTEC and IORA to create robust, inclusive institutional mechanisms.
Which builds regional trust.
They push blue economy development, partnering with island nations for economic growth, and taking a leadership role in climate change mitigation, which, as you said, builds trust. And they formalize coordinated surveillance agreements, partnering with external powers like France to multiply their naval capabilities and balance power.
Precisely. Let's do a quick chronological and geographical recap of Section 2. It is vital to remember where these places are to understand the strategy.
Go for it.
Djibouti. Located on the Horn of Africa, the gateway to the Red Sea. This is the location of China's first and currently only formal foreign military base.
Check.
Agalega, a remote dependency of Mauritius, 1,100 kilometers north of the main island. This is the site of India's strategically vital 10,000-foot runway and military infrastructure. La Réunion. Sovereign French territory in the southern Indian Ocean, serving as a hub for coordinated surveillance with India.
Got it.
The specific advanced long-range surveillance aircraft India is deploying to these island outposts to monitor Chinese submarine and surface activity.
The submarine hunter.
Right. And finally, Diego Garcia, the central Indian Ocean atoll hosting the massive US-UK base, transitioning sovereignty to Mauritius in 2024, but secured by a 99-year lease.
So, if we trace the line from the start, geopolitics, the 2024 Diego Garcia sovereignty transition, and China's push for African ports forces, a security response. That response is India's hard power P-8I infrastructure on Agalega. But hard power must be legitimized by diplomacy, which we see in the agreement on the 2024 security roadmap at the Colombo Security Conclave.
Which transitions us perfectly from the western flank to Major Section 3, the eastern anchor, the Andaman and Nicobar megaproject. We've spent a lot of time analyzing how India and its partners are attempting to secure the western perspective near Africa. Now we must pivot sharply to the east, to the Bay of Bengal.
To look at India's own backyard.
Exactly, to look at what is arguably India's most critical, natively owned geographic asset in the entire great power competition.
The background geography of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, often abbreviated as ANN, is absolutely staggering when you look at it on a map. We are talking about an Indian Union territory comprised of an archipelago of 572 islands, of which only 38 are actually inhabited.
Only 38 out of 572.
Yeah. It consists of two distinct groups, the Andaman Islands to the north and the Nicobar Islands to the south. And they are separated by a massive deep body of water called the 10-degree Channel, which is about 150 kilometers wide.
Positionally, their strategic value is almost incalculable. They act as a massive breakwater. The Andaman Sea lies to their east and the vast Bay of Bengal to their west. The territory is separated from Thailand and Myanmar by the Andaman Sea.
But the real kicker is the distance south.
Right, the most critical distance metric is this. The southernmost point of the Nicobar Islands, Indira Point, is located a mere 150 kilometers from the coast of Indonesia. To understand how far projected this territory is from the Indian mainland, look at the distances. The capital, Port Blair, is 1,255 kilometers from Kolkata across the Bay of Bengal. It is 1,200 kilometers from Visakhapatnam and 11,190 kilometers from Chennai.
Let that sink in. These sovereign Indian islands are actually located vastly closer to the sovereign countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Thailand than they are to the Indian mainland.
They're right in the thick of it.
The total land area of all these islands combined is approximately 8,249 square kilometers. The Andaman group is much larger at 6,408 square kilometers, and the Nicobar group is 1,841. And they aren't just empty military outposts, there is a growing demographic presence. The population grew from 380,581 in the 2011 census to an estimated 434,192 by 2022.
But the absolute root cause of their outsized disproportionate strategic importance is defined by two mathematical statistics. The actual landmass of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands constitutes just 0.2% of India's total landmass.
Just 0.2%.
However, because maritime law grants a 200 nautical mile radius around sovereign land, these scattered islands account for an astonishing 30% of India's total exclusive economic zone, or EEZ.
0.2% of the dirt provides 30% of the sovereign ocean rights. That is immense geopolitical leverage. And specifically, by holding these islands, India commands the 6-degree and 10-degree channels in the Andaman Sea.
The absolute arteries of commerce.
The intelligence brief explicitly states that these deep-water channels lead directly to the Strait of Malacca. They are the vital arteries to the sea lanes of communication along which almost all global commerce, including the life-or-death energy trade between the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific, flows. If the Strait of Malacca is the valve, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are the toll booth standing right in front of it.
Geopolitically, the Anihan Islands sit exactly at the intersection of the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the broader Pacific Ocean. Being the common maritime space between India and Southeast Asia, the Bay of Bengal and the adjoining Andaman Sea are vitally important for peninsular India's strategic maneuvers.
It's the perfect counterweight.
If China's greatest fear is the Malacca dilemma, India's greatest geographic advantage is holding the territory that overhangs the western approach to Malacca.
And this brings us to the trigger event for this specific section, because for decades, India largely ignored the strategic potential of these islands, treating them mainly as a remote environmental outpost.
A sleepy backwater.
But since 2020, in direct response to Chinese naval incursions, India has been aggressively pushing a mega infrastructure project located on Great Nicobar Island, the southernmost island in the chain. The stakeholders and objectives are incredibly ambitious.
What's the goal?
The government of India's vision is to leverage this unparalleled locational advantage sitting right on the main international east-west sea route and transform Great Nicobar into a sustainable, green, global destination for massive business, trade, and leisure.
The economic implications of this vision are driven by the four main, multi-billion-dollar components of this 2020 megaproject. First, and primarily, is the Galathea Bay International Container Transshipment Terminal, or ICTT.
We'll explain that in a second.
Right. Second, a massive Great Nicobar International Airport to handle civilian and strategic logistics. Third, a Great Nicobar gas and solar power plant to ensure the island isn't dependent on imported diesel. And fourth, the greenfield development of entire new coastal cities to support the workforce and tourism.
Let's expand on what an ICTT actually is, because transshipment terminal is a very specific piece of supply chain jargon. Currently, massive megaships from Europe or China rarely dock directly at Indian mainland ports because the mainland ports often lack the deep water draft required.
The water's too shallow.
So a megaship unloads its cargo at a massive hub in Colombo, Sri Lanka, or Singapore. Then smaller feeder ships carry those containers to India. India loses a fortune in transshipment fees to Sri Lanka and Singapore. The Galathea Bay ICTT aims to change that.
And capture that market.
Yes, Galathea Bay has a natural deep draft. By building a massive port there, right on the shipping lane, India can capture that lucrative transshipment traffic, servicing the megaships directly.
Exactly. The strategic motivations behind building this massive economic hub are deeply intertwined with national security. The geographical layout endows the islands with the potential to play a vital, dominant role in ascertaining maritime security in the entire eastern Indian Ocean, especially regarding maintaining freedom of navigation against an increasingly assertive China.
Showing the flag.
By developing this massive civilian and military dual-use capability, India projects its image not just as the participant, but as the net security facilitator and potential net security provider in the Southeast Asian region.
And there's a diplomatic leverage angle here, too. The sources note that by developing this hub, India can seek substantive quid pro quo arrangements with other nations. If India controls a massive, state-of-the-art logistical hub and intelligence gathering point overlooking Malacca, they can trade access for favors.
So what kind of favors?
This quid pro quo could be in terms of advanced military technology transfers from the U.S. or Japan, privileged commercial access, or deep intelligence sharing regarding Chinese submarine movements. The project aims to simultaneously create a major, highly profitable cargo transshipment center while embedding India deeply into the Indo-Pacific security architecture.
Ultimately, the hard security implications are entirely about countering the Chinese presence. Strengthening India's physical and economic presence in the Andaman Sea and the Southeast Asian region is a direct, robust counter to the Chinese naval submarines and survey vessels we discussed earlier that are increasingly prowling the Bay of Bengal.
It's drawing a line in the sand.
It is India saying, you are trying to surround us with a string of pearls, while we are fortifying the gate to your most vital energy route.
But this brings up the incredibly complex domestic impact framework. Geopolitics isn't played in a vacuum. It happens on real land, affecting real people. We must evaluate the institutional, legal, and ethical dimensions of such a massive, transformative undertaking on a pristine island. So what does this all mean for the local dynamics? Because the sources note intense, ongoing, heavy opposition to the mega project.
Yes, the brief explicitly notes that domestic opposition to the 2020 project is fierce and ongoing. This opposition is grounded in several highly critical, interconnected domestic concerns. First, the environment.
What's the environmental impact?
Great Nicobar is a UNESCO biosphere reserve, home to incredibly dense, ancient tropical rainforests and unique, endemic species like the Nicobar megapode and leatherback turtles. Constructing an ICTT, an international airport, and coastal cities requires cutting down millions of trees and dredging sensitive coral reefs.
That's a huge ecological cost.
Second, and perhaps most critically, is tribal preservation. The island is home to vulnerable indigenous communities, particularly the Shompen, a largely uncontacted hunter-gatherer tribe, and the Nicobarese. Pouring hundreds of thousands of construction workers, tourists, and logistics operators onto the island poses an existential demographic and cultural threat to these tribes.
It could wipe out their entire way of life.
Third, economists question the sheer long-term financial viability of the project. Can it truly compete with established hubs like Singapore or Colombo? And finally, the displacement of local, settled populations to make way for the infrastructure.
So India's balancing strategy here is incredibly fraught. It isn't just about balancing China externally, it's an agonizing internal balancing act. New Delhi has to weigh the absolute pressing existential concerns of national maritime security and macroeconomic growth against the ecological sustainability, the quality of life, and the very preservation of the vulnerable indigenous populations on the island.
It's not an easy choice.
No. The future implications hinge entirely on execution. Whether Great Nicobar can successfully function as a vital global cargo transshipment center and a military fortress without destroying the very sustainability and tribal heritage, it is legally and ethically bound to protect.
It is the ultimate dilemma of modern development meeting strategic necessity. If we synthesize this Eastern anchor into a core analytical narrative, say for a 250-word answer, the logic flows directly from the map. The geography dictates everything.
Well, let's run through that logic.
The Andaman and Nicobar Islands, sitting just 150 kilometers from Indonesia, form the critical intersection between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Theater. While they are a tiny fraction of India's landmass, they grant India command over 30% of its EEZ and absolute oversight of the 6 and 10-degree channels, which are the physical gateways to the Strait of Malacca and global SLOCs.
And because of that layout, India has the physical platform to project power and act as a net security facilitator to counter China's naval creep in the Bay of Bengal. But potential means nothing without capability, which is why India launched the 2020 Great Nicobar Mega Infrastructure Project.
Right. And while the strategic and economic benefits of fortifying the Malacca approach are unparalleled, driven by the Galathea Bay ICTT, the new airport, power plants, and urban development, the project faces profound domestic hurdles.
The pushback.
It represents a delicate, incredibly high-stakes balancing act. To secure its maritime frontiers against an expanding China and secure economic quid pro quo from allies, India must successfully navigate a minefield of domestic, legal, and ethical challenges. They must ensure that the unyielding imperatives of national security do not fatally compromise the unique environment and the survival of the island's indigenous Shompen population.
To lock down this section on Great Nicobar, let's just review the sheer scale of the distances and the geography. You need to remember that these islands are 1,255 kilometers away from Kolkata, but only 150 kilometers from Indonesia. They represent 30% of India's entire exclusive economic zone.
And the 4 pillars.
The 2020 mega project rests on 4 massive pillars. The Galathea Bay International Container Transshipment Terminal for deepwater cargo, the Great Nicobar International Airport for logistics and tourism, the gas and solar power plant for energy independence, and the new coastal cities for urban support.
And remember the key geographical features linking the strategy. The 10-degree channel separates the Andaman Islands from the Nicobar Islands, and along with the 6-degree channel, they form the critical choke points that oversee the approach to the Strait of Malacca.
That completes our incredibly detailed breakdown of the three major sections. We started with the grand, terrifying scale of global energy dependency, we moved to the hard power maneuvering off the coast of Africa, and we finished with the existential, complex development of island fortresses in the east.
It's a lot of ground or water to cover.
To ensure we really grasp the magnitude of what we've discussed, we must execute an interconnected summary, bridging all this intelligence together.
Let's trace the macro narrative from start to finish, viewing it as one massive, continuous geopolitical reaction. It all begins with a systemic, structural imbalance in the global economy. China's massive historical economic boom generated a critical, terrifying energy deficit.
The 85% problem.
Because 85% of its vital oil is bound through the Indian Ocean, and because it is essentially a landlocked power in this specific maritime theater due to the Malacca bottleneck, Beijing initiated a massive, unprecedented maritime expansion to secure its lifelines.
That expansion didn't happen in a vacuum. It physically materialized in the Western Indian Ocean. China established its first foreign military base in Djibouti, giving it a foothold at Bab el-Mandeb, and began pouring developmental finance into African ports along the Mozambique Channel.
Which rattled everyone.
This aggressive move deep into the Western theater fundamentally threatened the security of the sea lanes of communication that the rest of the world relies on.
Which inevitably triggered India's response. Recognizing its own severe vulnerability. Since India is dependent on the Persian Gulf for 90% of its oil, New Delhi was forced to operationalize its long-stated strategy of acting as a net security provider.
And how did they do that in the West?
In the West, this required a massive leap in hard power and diplomacy. India initiated coordinated surveillance with the French Navy from La Réunion and deployed advanced P-8I long-range submarine hunting aircraft to newly built infrastructure on Agalega in Mauritius, right in the heart of the contested Western waters.
But they couldn't just defend the West. They had to leverage their ultimate geographic advantage in the East. Recognizing that the Strait of Malacca is the primary naval navigational choke point that terrifies China's planners, India aggressively leveraged the Andaman and Nicobar Islands.
Standing at the toll booth.
By initiating the highly controversial Great Nicobar Mega Infrastructure Project, particularly the Galathea Bay ICTT, India ensures it firmly commands the 6 and 10-degree channels. They are effectively standing at the toll booth of global commerce, balancing China's massive expansion with their own formidable, undeniable maritime presence.
Across all these geographic theaters, from the Gulf of Aden to the Bay of Bengal, the macro themes remain remarkably constant. The desperate pursuit of national energy security fundamentally drives the need for expansive maritime security. And that competition over vulnerable choke points ultimately dictates every nation's quest for strategic autonomy in a multipolar Indian Ocean region.
It is a giant game of physical chess where the board is mostly water, and the pieces are oil tankers, P-8I aircraft, and billions of dollars in port loans. The patterns we've uncovered today are incredibly clear. Infrastructure development, whether it's a Chinese-funded deepwater port in East Africa or a 10,000-foot Indian military runway on a remote Mauritian island, is never just concrete and steel.
No, it's never just that.
It is the physical, undeniable manifestation of geopolitical intent.
And as we close this analysis, it is vital to remember that knowledge is most valuable when it is understood and applied critically. The treaties, the base leases, the economic zones, these are not static facts. They are dynamic, shifting realities that dictate the cost of everything we consume.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you with a final analytical challenge to mull over as you watch the news this week. We spent a lot of time talking about the historic October 2024 agreement regarding Diego Garcia.
A huge shift.
Consider how the fragile 99-year lease of that vital joint US-UK military base will interact with India's rapidly rising status as a net security provider and China's relentless, well-funded search for new ports. As the old unipolar maritime order dominated by the U.S. Navy since World War II shifts rapidly toward a fractured multipolarity, what happens next?
That's the big question.
Will the Indian Ocean's vital choke points, Malacca, Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, become venues for multilateral collaboration and shared prosperity, or will they become the very triggers for the next devastating, insurmountable global supply chain crisis?
That is the defining question of our era. It highlights the absolute fragility of global commerce. Keep questioning those assumptions, keep connecting the dots between remote geography and daily economic policy, and never stop analyzing the unseen currents that shape our world.
That concludes our deep dive into the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean region. Review your notes, keep an eye on those sea lanes, and we will see you next time.